My straight coworker took the blame for my mistake, then asked for one dinner gay love story. Hello everyone, and welcome back. If you enjoy emotional gay love stories with romance, powerful twists, and unforgettable endings, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We love seeing viewers from all over the world. Thank you for being here. Now let's dive into today's story. The fastest way to lose your career isn't making a mistake. It's watching the wrong person take the fall for it. If someone had told me that sentence would describe my life, I would have laughed, finished my coffee, and gone back to answering emails. Instead, I was standing in the largest conference room at Hawthorne Creative with 20 pairs of eyes fixed on me, while the giant presentation screen glowed like an accusation. My name sat neatly in the corner of the final campaign file. Impossible to ignore, impossible to explain away. The mistake looked small at first. One incorrect data set had slipped into a nationwide marketing proposal, changing projected numbers just enough to make our biggest client question every recommendation we had spent 3 exhausting weeks preparing. It wasn't the kind of error that destroyed a company, but it was exactly the kind that destroyed trust. And in advertising, trust paid the bills. My stomach twisted so tightly I could barely hear the vice president asking who had approved the report. I already knew the answer. I remembered rushing through the final review after staying late 3 nights in a row, telling myself I would double-check every chart before sending it. I never did. I opened my mouth, ready to admit everything, when a calm voice interrupted the silence. That was my oversight. Every head turned toward Adrian Hayes. He stood without hesitation, straightening the sleeves of his navy shirt, as though he were commenting on the weather instead of volunteering to carry someone else's disaster. Adrian was one of those coworkers everyone respected without really knowing. He always arrived 10 minutes early, never raised his voice, never joined office gossip, and somehow made impossible deadlines look routine. Most people called him quiet. I called him intimidating. We had worked together for almost 11 months, exchanged hundreds of professional conversations, and somehow I still couldn't predict what he was thinking. The vice president frowned. You signed off on these numbers? Adrian nodded once. Yes. My heart slammed against my ribs. No, that wasn't true. It couldn't be true. The file was mine. The mistake was mine. I tried to speak, but the words tangled somewhere between my lungs and my throat. Before I could untangle them, the meeting moved on. Questions shifted toward Adrian. Decisions were made. The client presentation was postponed. An internal review was scheduled. Every second felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's life through thick glass. When the meeting finally ended, people gathered their laptops in uneasy silence. A few coworkers gave Adrian sympathetic looks. Others avoided him altogether. No one looked at me. Maybe they assumed he really was responsible. Maybe they simply wanted to escape before another disaster unfolded. Adrian picked up his notebook, slipped it into his messenger bag, and walked toward the door. I hurried after him, nearly spilling my coffee in the process. Adrian, I called. He stopped but didn't turn around immediately. When he finally faced me, his expression was as composed as ever, giving away absolutely nothing. Why did you do that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He studied me for a long moment, his blue eyes calm enough to make me even more nervous. Then, with the faintest hint of a smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it came, he said, because today wasn't the right day for you to lose everything. I stood there long after Adrian disappeared down the hallway, replaying his words until they no longer sounded real. Because today was not the right day for you to lose everything. They should have felt comforting, but they landed like a weight I could not carry. The mistake belonged to me. Every spreadsheet, every revision, every final click before the presentation had been mine. Yet somehow Adrian had walked into the storm without even looking back to see if I would follow. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of ringing phones, hurried footsteps, and whispered conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. Hawthorne Creative had never been a loud office, but silence could be even more exhausting. I caught coworkers stealing quick glances at Adrian's empty desk before returning to their monitors. No one said his name out loud. Around 3 o'clock, I opened the original campaign files again, hoping I would discover some hidden detail proving that Adrian had actually shared responsibility. There was nothing. Every timestamp pointed to me. Every approval carried my initials. My chest tightened as I realized he had lied without hesitation to protect someone who barely knew how to hold a conversation with him outside of project meetings. I could not keep pretending this would somehow fix itself. I walked to human resources twice before turning around both times. If I confessed now, would they think Adrian and I had planned it together? Would admitting the truth only make things worse for him? My thoughts chased each other in circles until my phone vibrated against the desk. It was a company email announcing that Adrian had been temporarily removed from the client account while management completed an internal review. My stomach dropped. That promotion everyone expected him to receive next month suddenly felt very far away. I closed my laptop and stared out the office window. Below, evening traffic crawled through downtown Chicago, while people hurried along the sidewalks carrying grocery bags and umbrellas against the gray sky. Life outside continued as if nothing had happened, but inside the office every minute stretched a little longer than the last. At 6:15, I finally saw Adrian. He stepped out of the elevator carrying the same messenger bag, looking as composed as he had that morning. He was probably heading home after speaking with management. Before I could lose my nerve again, I hurried across the lobby. Adrian, wait. He slowed his pace and looked at me with quiet patience. I'm going to tell them the truth tomorrow morning. I blurted out. This has gone far enough. For a second I expected him to argue, but instead he studied my face like he was trying to solve a puzzle no one else could see. You should do whatever lets you sleep tonight, he said softly. But make sure you are doing it because it is right, not because you feel guilty. I frowned. How can you even tell the difference? A faint smile reached his eyes this time. Most people cannot. He adjusted the strap on his bag and turned toward the revolving doors. I watched him step into the cool evening air, blending into the stream of commuters heading home. And for the first time since I had joined the company, I realized I knew almost nothing about the man who had just risked his future for mine. The next morning, I walked into the office nearly an hour early, convinced that confessing everything would somehow untangle the mess I had created. Instead, I found another surprise waiting for me. Adrian was already there. His desk had been cleared except for a laptop, a notebook, and the small ceramic mug he used every morning. The client account had been taken away from him, yet he still showed up before almost everyone else. He looked up when he heard my footsteps and offered the same polite nod he always did, as though nothing unusual had happened. I stood beside his desk, rehearsing a dozen apologies that suddenly sounded shallow. I spoke with human resources, I admitted. I asked for a meeting this afternoon. Adrian closed the document he was reading. All right. That was it. No frustration. No disappointment. Just two simple words. That is all you are going to say? I asked. What else would help, he replied. I rubbed the back of my neck, feeling more awkward by the second. You should be angry. Would that change yesterday? I had no answer. Before I could think of one, the office slowly filled with familiar sounds. The coffee machine hissed in the break room. Someone laughed near the printers. Keyboards clicked like steady rain against glass. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, something had changed. Conversations paused whenever Adrian walked by. A few coworkers offered sympathetic smiles. Others acted as though they suddenly had somewhere else to be. Watching it happen hurt more than I expected. He had become the quiet center of a story that never belonged to him. Around lunchtime, I found myself eating alone in the small courtyard behind the building. My sandwich remained untouched while I stared at the fountain bubbling in the middle of the brick patio. You always look like you are solving a math problem when you eat. I looked up in surprise. Adrian stood a few feet away holding nothing but a paper cup of black coffee. I did not know you came out here, I said. Usually I do not. He glanced toward the empty chair across from me. May I? I nodded. For a while neither of us spoke. The breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from a nearby park, and somewhere down the block a street musician played an old jazz melody that drifted between the office buildings. The silence felt different this time. Less uncomfortable. More curious. Finally I took a deep breath. Why me? Adrian looked genuinely confused. What do you mean? There are more than 200 employees in this company. Why would you risk your reputation for me? He lowered his coffee cup and watched the water ripple across the fountain. Sometimes people deserve another chance before they know they need one. I searched his face for a joke, for sarcasm, for any sign that he was avoiding the real answer. But there was nothing except quiet sincerity. Before I could ask another question, his phone buzzed. He read the screen, slipped the device back into his pocket, then stood. I have to go. He took a few steps before stopping again. Without looking back, he said, "Do not cancel your meeting this afternoon." Then he walked inside, leaving me alone with a question that only grew heavier the longer I carried it. How could someone believe in me more than I believed in myself when I had never given him a reason to? The meeting with human resources lasted less than 20 minutes, but every second felt heavier than the one before it. I explained exactly what had happened, admitted that the incorrect file had been mine, and accepted full responsibility without trying to soften the truth. The manager listened carefully, asked a few questions, thanked me for my honesty, and promised to review everything with senior leadership before making a final decision. It was not the dramatic confession I had imagined. There were no raised voices, no instant resolution, just quiet notes typed into a laptop, while the future remained frustratingly uncertain. When I stepped back onto the office floor, I felt lighter for exactly 5 seconds. Then reality settled in again. Adrian still carried the consequences of a choice he never should have had to make. By the end of the workday, management announced that the investigation would continue through the week while they reviewed internal records and communication logs. That meant Adrian would remain off the client account until further notice. I caught him gathering papers into neat stacks, as if nothing had changed. The calm way he handled disappointment somehow made me feel even worse. As employees packed their bags and headed toward the elevators, I finally walked over to his desk. "Can we talk?" I asked. Adrian looked up from his notebook and closed it gently. "Of course." I took a slow breath. "I do not think my meeting fixed anything." "It was never going to happen in one afternoon," he replied. "These things take time. You keep acting like none of this bothers you." He smiled, but this one looked tired around the edges. "That does not mean it does not bother me." His honesty caught me off guard. For the first time, I noticed the faint shadows beneath his eyes and the loosened knot of his tie, small signs that even Adrian Hayes could have difficult days. We walked together toward the lobby in comfortable silence. Outside, the evening air carried the scent of rain, even though the sky had not opened yet. Office workers hurried past us with backpacks and takeout bags, eager to escape another long Tuesday. We reached the front steps, and I turned toward him. "I still owe you an apology." Adrian slipped one hand into his jacket pocket. "You do? Then let me buy you dinner. It is the least I can do." He laughed quietly, the sound so unexpected that I almost forgot what I had asked. "Actually," he said, "I was planning to ask. You first." I blinked. "You were?" "Yes." He looked directly at me, completely unbothered by my confusion. "One dinner. That is all I want." I frowned. "After everything that has happened, you want dinner?" "I do." "Why?" He tilted his head slightly, thinking for a moment before answering. "Because conversations are easier over good food than fluorescent office lights." I could not help smiling for the first time in days. "That is your reason?" "It is the only one I am willing to give today." I shook my head with a quiet laugh. "You are impossible to figure out. Most people stop trying." He started walking toward the parking garage, then glanced back over his shoulder. "Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. There is a small Italian restaurant 3 blocks from here. They make excellent homemade pasta." "You already picked the place?" "Weeks ago," he answered without thinking. The words slipped out so naturally that even he seemed surprised he had said them. He paused for a heartbeat, gave me a polite nod, and continued walking, leaving me standing on the sidewalk wondering why a man who barely knew me had apparently chosen a restaurant long before either of us had planned to share a meal. The entire next day moved with the strange rhythm of waiting for something that refused to arrive. Every time my email notification chimed, my pulse jumped, expecting another message from management about the investigation. Instead, I received routine updates, calendar invitations, and reminders about deadlines that suddenly felt unimportant. Adrian carried on as though nothing had changed. He completed smaller assignments, answered questions from teammates with his usual calm patience, and somehow managed to smile at the receptionist every morning. Watching him made me wonder if composure was something people were born with or something they earned after surviving enough difficult days. By 6:30 that evening, I had changed my shirt twice before leaving my apartment. It was ridiculous. This was only dinner. Coworkers ate together all the time. Yet something about meeting Adrian outside the office felt completely different. When I arrived at the little Italian restaurant, warm lights glowed through the front windows, reflecting softly against the sidewalk after a brief summer rain. Adrian was already there, standing near the entrance with his hands in his jacket pockets. "You are early," I said. He smiled. "You are 2 minutes late." I checked my watch and laughed. "Seriously?" "No," he admitted. "I only wanted to see if you would look." Inside, the restaurant smelled of fresh bread, basil, and garlic. Soft jazz floated through the room, while families talked quietly over steaming plates of pasta. It felt comfortable in a way expensive restaurants never did. Adrian greeted the owner by name, and the older man welcomed him back with an easy smile before leading us to a corner table by the window. "You have been here before," I observed after we sat down. "Many times. With friends." Adrian hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "Usually alone." That answer surprised me more than it should have. I had always assumed someone as dependable and confident as Adrian would have a busy social life. Instead, he unfolded his napkin with practiced simplicity, as though solitary dinners were completely ordinary. We ordered our meals, and conversation drifted naturally toward harmless topics. Favorite movies. Terrible office coffee. The strange habit our accounting manager had of humming movie soundtracks while reviewing budgets. I laughed more during that first half hour than I had all week. Adrian had a dry sense of humor that almost never appeared at work. It surfaced quietly, hidden inside perfectly timed observations that caught me off guard every single time. Halfway through dinner, our food arrived, and for a while we simply enjoyed the peaceful silence. Then Adrian looked across the table and asked, "Can I tell you something without making this awkward?" I raised an eyebrow. "That depends on what it is." He rested his fork beside his plate. "Everyone in the office thinks I am straight." I blinked. "Well, I assume that too. Most people do." He shrugged lightly, showing no embarrassment at all. "I have never bothered correcting anyone because nobody ever asked." I stared at him for a moment, realizing how little any of us actually knew about the people sitting a few desks away every day. "Does it bother you?" I asked carefully. "Not really," he replied. "The people who matter usually learn the truth eventually." His answer lingered between us long after the words faded. For reasons I could not explain, I suddenly remembered the way he had looked at me after the meeting, the quiet certainty in his voice, and the restaurant he admitted he had chosen weeks before. Tiny moments that had seemed unrelated began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I had not realized I was holding. Adrian noticed my thoughtful expression but did not rush to explain anything. Instead, he simply smiled, lifted his glass of iced tea, and asked if I wanted to split a slice of homemade cheesecake because, according to him, no good conversation should ever end without dessert. By the time we stepped outside, the city had settled into that quiet hour when office towers reflected more lights than people. The sidewalks were still busy, but everyone seemed to be walking towards somewhere familiar, while I felt as though I had accidentally wandered into a completely different version of my own life. Adrian offered to walk with me for a few blocks before heading toward the train station, and I accepted without thinking. The conversation drifted as easily as it had over dinner. We talked about childhood hobbies, favorite bookstores, and the ridiculous amount of money people willingly spend on fancy coffee every morning. It felt effortless, which only made me wonder why we had spent nearly a year limiting ourselves to project deadlines and polite greetings. The next morning, however, reality returned the moment I stepped into the office. Two designers stopped talking when Adrian and I entered the elevator together. Someone from accounting smiled a little too knowingly when I wished Adrian good morning. By lunch, whispers floated across the open office like invisible paper airplanes. Nobody said anything directly, but curiosity traveled faster than email in every workplace I had ever known. I tried convincing myself I was imagining it until my teammate Melissa leaned against my cubicle with an amused grin. "So," she said, "since when do you and Adrian have dinner together?" I nearly dropped my pen. "It was just dinner." She raised one eyebrow. "Relax. I am not judging. People are simply surprised. Adrian usually keeps to himself." Before I could answer, she added, "Although I have noticed he never really keeps to himself when you are around." The comment stayed with me long after she walked away. That afternoon, I caught myself paying attention to details I had somehow ignored for months. Adrian always remembered exactly how I took my coffee whenever he volunteered to make a break room run. He automatically saved the chair beside him during team meetings if I arrived late. Whenever someone interrupted me during brainstorming sessions, Adrian quietly redirected the conversation back so I could finish my idea. None of those moments had seemed remarkable on their own. Together, they painted a picture I had never bothered to see. Around 4 o'clock, our creative director stopped by my desk with an update. Management had reviewed the meeting recordings, internal files, and email history. My confession matched every piece of evidence they found. The investigation was officially closed. I would receive a formal warning and mandatory quality review training, but no further disciplinary action. More importantly, Adrian would be restored to the client account immediately. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I had to grip the edge of my desk. When I looked across the office, Adrian happened to glance up from his computer. I smiled before I even realized I was doing it. He smiled back, small and genuine, and somehow that felt better than the announcement itself. Later that evening, after most people had gone home, I walked over to thank him again. Before I could speak, he closed his laptop and stood. "Good," he said. "You look like you can finally breathe." I laughed softly. I did not realize it showed. It always does. I shook my head. "You notice everything, do not you?" Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering with quiet honesty. "Only when it comes to people who matter to me." The hallway suddenly felt much quieter than before. My heartbeat became strangely loud, inside my own ears, and for a brief second I wondered whether that sentence carried more meaning than he intended, or whether I was simply beginning to hear things that had been there all along. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, except nothing about it was actually ordinary anymore. Adrian had returned to the client account. The office had moved on to the next impossible deadline, and the whispers about us had gradually faded into background noise. Even so, something between us had quietly changed. Morning greetings became conversations. Coffee breaks stretched a few minutes longer than necessary. We started leaving the office together whenever our schedules happened to line up, although after the third week it no longer felt like coincidence. One Friday afternoon, we stayed late preparing revisions for a client presentation. The rest of the floor had emptied until only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner echoed through the building. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing tired eyes after staring at spreadsheets for hours. "I think every number on this page is starting to look exactly the same," I muttered. Adrian laughed softly and slid a small chocolate bar across my desk. "Emergency office supplies." I looked at him in surprise. "You keep chocolate in your laptop bag?" "Only on Fridays." "Why?" He shrugged. "Because Fridays are usually harder than people admit." I smiled as I unwrapped it. "You really do think about everything." "Not everything." His answer came so quietly I almost missed it. We finished the presentation just before 8 o'clock and decided to walk instead of calling for rides immediately. The evening air felt cooler than usual, carrying the first hints of early fall through downtown Chicago. Storefront windows reflected rows of warm lights across the sidewalks while couples, families, and tourists wandered between restaurants. We stopped outside a small independent bookstore that was preparing to close for the night. Adrian stared through the display window for a moment, then smiled to himself. "I have not been here in years." "Do you like reading?" I asked. "Probably. More than I should." I laughed. "That explains why your emails always sound like someone actually proofread them." He gave me a playful look. "Unlike yours. Mine sound like they were written during a fire drill." We both laughed, and the easy silence that followed felt comfortable instead of awkward. As we continued walking, Adrian suddenly asked, "Do you remember volunteering at the Lincoln Park Community Career Fair 3 years ago?" I frowned, searching my memory. "Maybe. I volunteered at a few events after college." "There was a rainstorm that afternoon," he continued. "The power went out for almost an hour." The memory slowly returned. Folding tables, wet umbrellas, high school students waiting for career advice, while everyone scrambled to keep the event running. "I remember the rain," I said. "Not much else." Adrian nodded as though he expected that answer. "You probably would not." He looked ahead instead of at me. One of the volunteers was a recent graduate who had just lost his first job that morning. He almost went home before the event even started. I listened quietly while he continued. Another volunteer sat with him in the cafeteria for nearly an hour. They talked about failure, second chances, and how one bad day did not decide an entire future. My steps slowed. "That sounds familiar." Adrian finally turned toward me with a gentle smile that carried years of unspoken history. "It should." My heart skipped. "Wait." He nodded once. That volunteer was you. I stared at him, completely speechless. You were there? You never asked my name, he said with a small laugh. But before you left, you told me something I have never forgotten. You said that someday, if life gave you the opportunity, you hoped someone would believe in another person the way you had believed in me that afternoon. He lowered his eyes for just a moment before meeting mine again. Last week, I simply returned the favor you did not even remember giving. For several long seconds, I could not find a single word. The sounds of the city faded into the background until all I could hear was the quiet honesty in Adrian's voice. I searched my memory again, and little fragments slowly drifted back like photographs pulled from an old box. A crowded school cafeteria, rain striking the windows. A nervous young man sitting alone with a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. I remembered sitting beside him because everyone else seemed too busy. I remembered telling him that careers could be rebuilt, confidence could return, and one difficult day never deserved the final chapter of someone's story. I remembered walking away believing I would never see him again. I just never realized that man had been Adrian. I cannot believe I forgot, I whispered. Adrian smiled gently. You were helping a stranger. You probably had dozens of conversations like that. Not like that. I shook my head slowly. I always believed people remembered kindness less than mistakes. Sometimes, he replied, they remember kindness the longest. We stood outside the bookstore until the owner locked the front door and wished us a pleasant evening. Neither of us moved right away. It felt as though the past had quietly stepped into the present and introduced itself. During the following week, everything at work seemed brighter. Maybe nothing around me had actually changed. Maybe I had. Then, just when life finally felt steady again, another unexpected problem appeared. Our largest client received an anonymous email claiming that confidential campaign concepts had been leaked before the upcoming product launch. The accusation spread through senior management before lunch, and another emergency meeting filled the conference room with anxious conversations. My heart sank as several executives looked toward me. Since I had recently been involved in one investigation, it did not take much for suspicion to circle back in my direction. I saw the uncertainty in a few familiar faces. It hurt, but I understood it. This time, however, Adrian did not step forward to carry the blame. Instead, he calmly connected his laptop to the conference room screen. Before anyone reaches conclusions, he said, there is something you should see. He opened a detailed timeline showing document access logs, security records, and archived email activity collected by the information technology department earlier that morning. Every file related to the campaign had been tracked automatically. The anonymous claims did not match the actual records. The data showed that none of the protected files had ever left the company's secure system. Even more surprising, the investigation identified that the email had been sent using a fake account created outside the organization by someone attempting to disrupt the client relationship. The room fell silent. Questions shifted away from me almost immediately. Relief spread across the faces around the table as the executives realized there had never been an internal leak at all. After the meeting ended, people slowly returned to work, grateful that another crisis had been avoided. I found Adrian gathering his laptop, and before I could thank him, he spoke first. I told you before, he said quietly. I was not going to let you lose everything. I looked at him, finally understanding that this had never been about one mistake or one project. The first dinner was never about paying you back, was it? Adrian exhaled with a small, almost nervous smile that I had never seen before. No, he held my gaze without looking away. I only wanted one evening where you would choose to spend time with me because you wanted to, not because work required it. I hoped that if we talked long enough, you might eventually see me the way I had quietly seen you for years. Adrian's words settled gently between us, and for the first time since we met, silence did not feel uncertain. It felt complete. I looked at the man standing across from me and realized that every important moment in our story had started with him quietly choosing kindness when no one was watching. He never demanded recognition. He never expected anything in return. He simply believed that people deserved patience, even when they could not yet see the best version of themselves. I smiled before I even realized I was doing it. You have been waiting a long time, I said softly. Adrian gave a small shrug, his familiar expression returning. Some things are worth waiting for. I laughed quietly, shaking my head. You really should have told me sooner. Would "You have believed me?" he asked. I opened my mouth, then stopped. Months ago, I probably would have assumed he was joking or misunderstood his intentions. Back then, I had been too busy doubting myself to imagine someone like Adrian could possibly see me the way he did. "Probably not," I admitted. "Exactly." We walked out of the conference room together, and for the first time, I did not worry about who might see us. A few coworkers glanced our way, but instead of whispering, several smiled. Melissa passed by carrying a stack of folders and looked at both of us with an expression that said she had figured everything out long before either of us had. "About time," she said with a grin before disappearing around the corner. I felt my face grow warm while Adrian simply laughed. Somehow that laugh made the entire office feel lighter. A month later, the client campaign launched successfully, becoming one of the company's strongest projects of the year. During the celebration, our creative director thanked everyone for their hard work and surprised Adrian with the promotion that had been delayed during the investigation. The entire office applauded as he accepted the new role with his usual quiet humility. When the meeting ended, he walked straight toward me instead of joining the crowd gathered around him. "Are you free tonight?" he asked. I smiled. "I think I know a place with excellent homemade pasta." His eyes brightened with recognition. "And cheesecake." "Definitely cheesecake." That evening, we returned to the same little Italian restaurant where everything had begun. The owner welcomed us with the same warm smile and even seated us at the corner table by the window without asking. As we looked through the menus, I realized neither of us had touched them. We already knew exactly what we wanted. Somewhere between the bread basket and dessert, I reached across the table and rested my hand beside his. I did not rush. I did not overthink it. I simply let the moment exist. Adrian looked down for a second before meeting my eyes with the brightest smile I had ever seen on his face. He gently turned his hand until our fingers rested comfortably together on the table. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Adrian's thumb brushed softly across the back of my hand, and when I looked up, he was already watching me. There was something different in his expression now, something warmer and more vulnerable than the quiet confidence I had grown used to seeing. "You know," I whispered with a smile, "for someone who waited this long, you are still incredibly patient." Adrian laughed softly, but his eyes never left mine. "I was waiting for you to be sure." Something inside me softened at those words. For months, Adrian had been the one taking chances, noticing the things I overlooked, and believing in me when I struggled to believe in myself. This time, I wanted to be the one who moved first. I stood from my chair, and Adrian rose with me as though he already understood. For one quiet second, we simply looked at each other beside that little corner table where everything between us had begun. The restaurant continued around us, filled with soft jazz and quiet conversation, but all of it seemed to fade into the distance. I stepped closer. Adrian's expression softened, and I could see the smallest nervous smile appear on his face. I leaned toward him slowly, giving him every chance to understand what I wanted. Adrian met me halfway. Our lips touched in a soft, lingering kiss, gentle enough that the moment felt less like a surprise and more like the answer to a question we had both been carrying for a long time. There was no rush and no uncertainty, only warmth and the unmistakable feeling that we had finally arrived at something we had been moving toward long before either of us knew how to name it. When we slowly pulled apart, Adrian stayed close, his forehead resting lightly against mine. For once, the man who always seemed to know exactly what to say looked almost speechless. I smiled. "Worth the wait." Adrian let out a quiet laugh, and the happiness in his eyes made my heart beat even faster. Every second, I laughed softly before leaning in and giving him one more brief, tender kiss. When we returned to our seats, our hands found each other again almost naturally beneath the warm restaurant lights. It was a small gesture, almost ordinary, yet somehow it carried every conversation, every second chance, every quiet act of faith, and now our first kiss that had finally brought us there. 1 year later, Friday dinners had become our favorite tradition. No matter how busy work became or how stressful life felt, we always found our way back to that little corner table. Sometimes we celebrated successes. Sometimes we laughed about mistakes. Sometimes we sat in comfortable silence while the city lights shimmered beyond the window. And every once in a while, I would catch Adrian looking at me across the table with that same quiet smile he had worn the night we first came there, and I would remember how close I had come to never understanding what that smile meant. Looking back, I realized the greatest change in my life had never been the promotion, the projects, or even the day everything nearly fell apart. It was learning that the strongest kind of love does not always arrive with grand speeches or perfect timing. Sometimes it begins with one quiet person believing in you long before you learn how to believe in yourself. And sometimes all it asks for in return is one simple dinner.